Hello and welcome. I'm Andy Hodges and I'm here at the 30th session of the Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts of Southern Africa, held under the auspices of the Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, Sub-Regional Office for Southern Africa. Conversation is all about leveraging renewable energy resources for a just energy transition in Southern Africa. Now, of course, one of the largest countries in Southern Africa, in fact, one of what some may term the economic powerhouse of SADC and Southern Africa, is South Africa, of course. Now, I have great pleasure in introducing and welcoming Mr. Nelson Muffuh. He's the UN Resident Coordinator for South Africa to talk about issues about energy in South Africa and also the region. Sir, welcome. It's a pleasure talking to you.
No, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Now, South Africa is an interesting case because, of course, for the last few years, in fact, South Africa had more of a power shortage, a critical power shortages than most of us. I mean, now it's obviously a little bit different with the El Nino drought. There were constant rolling blackouts or energy spikes, and suddenly they've turned around, and suddenly they have excess power, and people have all power all the time. They seem to have sort of put a deliberate strategy. So maybe you could talk about, firstly, the energy situation then and now in South Africa.
So I wouldn't say suddenly or overnight there was light. I think it took some dedicated effort over a period of time to turn around a situation which some argue could have been prevented in the first place. It wasn't due to lack of available energy. It was governance issues, criminality, and the general mismanagement of energy supply and distribution. So with political will and the president and the government saying they needed to turn this around with the support of partners, this then I think progressively led to a situation where from 78% rolling blackouts to none. And from an energy availability factor of about 50% to now ranging between 65 and 70%. So that tells you what can be done when there's political will, a decision to address a situation, but to do that collectively in a whole of society, whole of economy, and across government manner. A Minister of Electricity was established. The Energy Action Plan was reinforced. A collaboration with the private sector and the business leaders was established to also help with regards to the sourcing of the required talent, best engineers to be made available to work with the energy generating company to make maintenance and repairs more effective. It was essential, that very important. And so a combination of all of these factors, including liberalizing the renewable energy sector, that led then to more renewable energy projects. Solar, wind, which actually has led to, I think, a quick shift.
There is a bit of an elephant in the room here because South Africa obviously its economy is predominantly based on fossil fuels, and in fact studies show that they're the largest polluter in Africa, in fact in Southern Africa definitely, and maybe even in Africa. And that then talks about exactly what the United Nations, one of their primary goals, which is climate action. It's about making sure that the environment is protected. So how can you balance the fact that people need electricity, they haven't had it, it's now fossil fuel-based electricity, but on the other side, it's creating huge pollution, huge environmental damage, and in fact, will probably not allow South Africa to achieve at least one of the SDGs by 2030.
I mean, you're going to the heart of Goal 7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is about access to renewable, affordable, and stable energy. And also an acknowledgement that for a country like South Africa that, yes, it's polluting, but it's not historically responsible for the climate challenge that we're facing. There is a transition period that needs to be put in place, a supported transition. And that's why the UN advocated for and is accompanying South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is a partnership with international partners who are making available to South Africa thus far about $13.4 billion. Close to a billion of that is grants And about half of that is concessional loans, which is about realizing that South Africa needs to be supported to access concessional finance to work on the transition away from fossil fuels over time. Because the transition needs to take into consideration the natural endowment the country has, which is coal. It needs to take into consideration the ecosystem around coal, the workers, the miners, the businesses, the power plants, and what you progressively do around decommissioning and shifting away.
You almost have to create separate industries to absorb a workforce which is no longer working in the mines. And of course that has its own issues, particularly in South Africa with the unions and labor, but we won't go into that. It becomes complicated. The issue that I think is most concerning, and even speaking to experts, is how to industrialize, how to economically grow, and I think South Africa is no different to the rest of Southern Africa, but also to not leave the rural citizens where the majority of people live behind. In fact, what you could be doing is creating a wider poverty inequality between urban and rural just by industrializing and growing your economy. What are your views on that?
I mean, you're right. I mean, that's the mantra, leave no one behind, right? Is to ensure that as you're transforming socioeconomically and otherwise, you are not leaving those who are in rural communities. In the South African context, you also have people who are in informal settlements, people who are in sectors that are negatively impacted by the transition that you need to look at. But I also always say, in not leaving everyone behind, you need to carry everyone along who can positively contribute to this transition. There is the just energy transition economic ecosystem that is an opportunity. The skilling, upskilling, and reskilling of workers who previously would be working in coal-fired power plants, giving them the requisite skills to be able to work in the renewable sector. We have
capacity building,
training, exposing them to new ways of working, technologies and opportunities. If they were working on a coal-fired power plant, can they be given the skills now to work in the renewable sector? Taking the advantage also of the renewables industrialization process. We're talking about the batteries and electric vehicles, and how can South Africa and its workers and the economy take advantage of that? Because it's about progressively losing something that you're used to embracing something that really can help you leapfrog and transition. If you add digital technologies as well in there, you train young people, you train women, you provide financing for small and medium-sized enterprises, then they can be part of the transition.
And as well, I mean, that also speaks to exactly what the UN talks about, which is this gender, youth, marginalized communities, people with disabilities. Whatever happens in Southern Africa and in South Africa, it has to be inclusive. Countries cannot afford to leave certain portions or segments of the situation. I mean, if you look at gender in Southern Africa, it's over 50% are women. So it doesn't make a lot of sense economically to leave them out of any economic planning, even energy poverty or lack of energy for their business.
Leave people behind and leave them out of economic transformation, then you're exacerbating an already concerning context of heightened inequalities. Southern Africa South Africa has one of the highest levels of inequalities in the world, one of the highest levels of youth unemployment in the world, and persisting poverty. Some of this and a lot of this, it's legacy issues from apartheid, but a lot of it can be dealt with and should be dealt with now. And this gives us an opportunity. And so that's why the UN in South Africa and across the sub-region is working at ensuring that everyone is part and parcel of this transformation.
And I liked what the African Union the representative spoke about. Yes, the African Union SAL representative, he spoke about the community level. This isn't about someone sitting in some ivory tower making a decision. So everybody needs to get involved in this conversation right down from the community level to understand how it impacts them and how it will benefit them. Is that?
Definitely, and that's why we're spending an inordinate amount of time necessarily to consult, to look at engaged communities who are impacted. For example, by the decommissioning of coal power plants around Mpumalanga, Komati in South Africa, and across the country as well. So there is actually an effort to make sure that we're talking to communities, and government is also talking to communities, and we're helping in that process. When we talk of communities, you segment it: women, children, traditional leaders, workers, entrepreneurs, indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and to make sure that their perspectives and talents are taken into consideration as well.
What's I wouldn't call it what ironic is that energy actually speaks to a lot of SDGs. You talk about education, access to water, or even agriculture in their food security, where people need solar to pump water or use solar for their plows in the rural areas. So energy seems to underpin a lot of the SDGs, but of course, in this matrix of renewable, clean energy, and I'm sure that no one can really get 100% with the fossil fuels, I'm sure, not in the short term, but is that the true statement, that energy does play a significant role in some of the achievements of some of the SDGs?
Certainly. Now, the SDGs, 17 of them are interconnected, and energy is an important entry point to be able to touch all of the other SDGs. Right now, we're talking about transitions, 6 transitions that can help us propel action on the SDGs. Energy is top amongst those. Education, certainly, as well. Digitization or digital connectivity. Social protection and jobs, very important as well, right? And dealing with climate challenges and managing the environment and potable water. So if you look at energy, since we're talking about that now, you've mentioned its interconnection with all the others. I mean, when South Africa was going through its energy crisis, you could see the impact on food systems, on education, on health, on economic activity, on just the general business environment and investment flows. So you can really see how, if you focus on energy and connect it with the opportunities that innovation, digitization provides, the skilling, upskilling, learning, education, healthcare, and ensuring that people do not suffer then from pollution and hospitals do not get impacted. You connect that as well then to everything else that the government is doing to propel the economy forward with regards to industrialization, manufacturing. You can clearly see the benefit in helping countries leapfrog.
Now, one of the criticisms, again, from experts is, or in fact, I don't know, it's not even a criticism, it was actually said openly in most of the speeches, was the need to enhance and improve regional integration, cohesive policies that speak to each other from a national level, feeding into the Southern African level, which is probably SADC, and that there's a lot of work to be done on that. What are your views about that?
I mean, we need to increasingly move towards integration. That's why, for example, we have a global agenda like the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, as part of a 2030 agenda package, which is also aligned to the African Union's 2063 agenda, all talking about we need an integrated approach and working together to solve common challenges, including sustainability challenges, including the need for trading systems that talk to each other and investment flows that talk to each other. So definitely that's where we're nudging countries along into, and the UN system certainly is working in that way. We have a repositioned UN development system now that is really about the UN in South Africa working with the UN in Zimbabwe, or Eswatini, or Lesotho, or Ethiopia, sharing best practices, connecting systems, benchmarking, and looking at how can we really help these countries leapfrog and take people along.
That takes me to our next question. Again, and I posed this to most of the African Union, COMESA, SADC. The question is this. We're talking in United Nations. Of course, all the countries are part there. They've all signed the SDGs. They understand the energy transition. Then you have COMESA also talking about this. You've got SADC also talking about it. You may have West Africa, ECOWAS. You may have ECA. I could keep going. And then you have individual policies whereby South Africa, which is fossil fuel dependent, Zambia, which is hydro, Malawi, hydro, Zimbabwe. Is there a nexus where everybody is actually following one policy? Or are we talking about 6, 7 different policies? And I know the argument is, they all sit in these committees so they all know what's happening. But I don't think that's true from looking at it from the outside. Is there a nexus where we're all following one policy that we all can agree with? Sure, they may differ from nation to nation. What do you think about that?
I think policy coherence is important. And that's why there was the effort to say at the global level, we need to come up with the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, including the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in the regions, countries can then talk about how applicable those are and how to go about also applying them, mindful of the specific context they're operating in. So it's not to have, I would say, contradictory conversations, but aligned conversations. And that's what we're pushing. We would hope that, including, for example, at the African Union level, decisions that are taken there get then cascaded down to the Regional Economic Commission's level. And that before even these global decisions are taken, they draw from the experiences and recommendations from SADC.
And criticism again, great documents, great vision, SDGs are there, action. And I think that's one thing everyone says about some African countries, that they have great things, but actionable recommendations where they actually follow through and they do them could be the missing chink. Because you don't want to be sitting in a year's time saying, well, we discussed this last year and we're still discussing it. We want to see at least some small step forward.
Bear in mind, I believe largely if we implement what has been agreed and what we know is right and spend less time talking and more time doing, we will be resolving a lot of the challenges that African countries are facing. We know largely what is right. It is a matter of improving.
Brains in the world, I believe.
It's about accountable governance that implements for the benefit of people, that monitors, course corrects as needed, and includes people in doing that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Let's talk about one area which, of course, is critical to any kind of just transition and even linking it into finance, and that's the private sector. Because government is an enabler. Government isn't supposed to be out there building power stations and building solar factories and so forth. That is the private sector on a profit basis. So talk to me about the importance, particularly in South Africa, of the private sector coming to the party. I know recently the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, held a meeting with internal business to say, can you invest in the country rather than start looking outside? Why don't you put your money in the country? How important is it for the private sector to be involved in this so that we do have a profitable but also just energy transition, which also though is viably important for them. It isn't just throwing money down the sink, so to speak.
It is good business. It is also an imperative that everyone plays their part. We talked about including people, groups that are being left behind. I mentioned the importance of a whole of economy intervention, and government on their own, international partners, the UN, or citizens on their own cannot do this. You need to include the private sector, and they need to also come and be part of the puzzle that helps us deal with existential challenges, including the climate challenge and the need to transition away from fossil fuels into renewable energy generation, profitable, as you say, sustainable, resilient, but also affordable. And that's where you have to bring them to the table. They have the assets, the knowledge base, they can share the risks. I would say they also have the responsibility to play their part. So that's why it is in their interest. But we're also moving into a context where looking after global public goods is in the interest of everyone. Profits is not only about the amount of money you make, but the positive contribution you make towards humanity and the well-being of people and the planet. So valuing that through ESG standards and other things becomes more important, including at the stock exchanges now, right? So the UN is encouraging that and working with the government and private sector in South Africa especially to say you need a collaborative effort. So what you refer to is the president engaging with over 130 business leaders to say, let's collaborate to solve the energy crisis, the logistics challenges, the security and governance challenges as a start. And from there, lead to more job creation, a better enabling environment for business and investments, and growth that will help everyone.
We're uplifting our citizens, because isn't that the bottom line for all leaders? And that's it. It's about us. The elephant in the room, money, balancing industrialization, economic growth. You're still running an economy on fossil fuel. You're trying to transition into renewables and clean energy, which costs money to put in the system. African governments don't have money. They're looking at trying to get food security. They're trying to build roads. They're trying to build bridges. They're trying to build infrastructure. And suddenly, $1 billion to build a plant on solar or to focus. This can't happen. I mean, you can take steps towards it, but it can't happen now. the money is the problem. How do you think that financing issue is an issue? I mean, 109 billion climate gap, only 2.2 billion came in, mostly to South Africa and Mozambique. So money, I suppose, is the $1 million question, so to speak.
And money from multiple sources. We talk about the financing mix. It has to be income generated by the government itself through taxation, income generated through capital markets, income generated through investment flows, and income generated through the multilateral development system. It is important to be able to bring all of that together. That's why the UN and the Secretary General is calling for a reform of the global financial architecture, a capitalization of the multilateral development banks, an increase in official development assistance, looking at credit rating, and so that African countries should be able to better raise capital in capital markets without negative and I would say really unfortunate ratings that do not really reflect the conditions of those markets. So there are multiple ways to look at the financing question, but Africa needs to start by looking from within. What can we mobilize, including through our pension funds and our sovereign wealth.
You're right, because what you don't want to do is go and get access to finance, which puts you more in debt, because that just creates a worse problem for poverty and so forth, eradication. The United Nations position as a final thought, sir, what would you like as the United Nations in South Africa, for example? What would you like to see in the short term? What would be, you believe, that the top 3 UN recommendations that you would say right now to South Africa in terms of this just transition and what they may need to do to move into this sort of more renewables and moving away from fossil and, of course, polluting in the environment damage?
I would say continue to embrace the transition as an opportunity to address socioeconomic issues, because with the just energy transition, if done right and with the right stakeholders and through inclusion, unemployment challenges could be resolved. Industrialization, manufacturing could become something that really is an opportunity by looking at the ecosystem and value chain of renewables, and be resolute also about mobilizing financing, including from the international community that has a responsibility to support South Africa, whilst also South Africa mobilizes internally.
And in fact, you made a very good point, because we're now also talking about growing regional trade. And of course, so you're right, it's a completely holistic, interlinked approach we have. Mr. Nelson Muffuh, UN resident coordinator in South Africa. So thank you so much for speaking today. Much appreciated. Well, there we had it. That was United Nations resident coordinator from South Africa, Mr. Nelson Muffuh. So I'm Andy Hodges. Thank you, goodbye, and please, you all be safe.